The easiest way to hide a lie is to bury it beneath old paperwork and hope nobody ever starts asking questions. That thought stayed with me the morning I finally carried the last moving box through the front door of the old lakefront mansion I had spent nearly 18 months bringing back to life. The smell of fresh cedar mixed with newly polished hardwood floors. Sunlight shimmered across the calm water outside the oversized living room windows, and for the first time since purchasing the neglected property, the house actually felt like a home instead of a construction project. Every cracked window had been replaced, every damaged beam carefully restored, and every faded room had slowly regained the dignity it deserved. Standing there with a cup of hot coffee in my hand, I believed the hardest part of the journey was finally behind me. Then I noticed a large certified envelope resting neatly against the front door. It had not been there when I carried in my first load that morning. Across the upper left corner appeared the familiar logo of the Homeowners Association. I smiled, assuming it contained nothing more than a welcome packet or information about upcoming neighborhood meetings. Instead, the first sentence stopped me cold. According to the letter, I owed nearly 3 decades of unpaid Homeowners Association dues, accumulated interest, administrative penalties, and legal fees dating all the way back to 1998. The total exceeded $70,000. I read every page twice, convinced I had misunderstood something. The notice claimed the debt belonged to the property itself and had transferred automatically to me when I purchased the mansion. Payment was demanded within 30 days or additional collection procedures could begin. At the bottom of the final page appeared the signature of Susan Whitmore, the current president of the Homeowners Association. I slowly folded the letter and looked out toward the peaceful lake where a light breeze rippled across the water. Nothing outside suggested anything was wrong. Ducks drifted quietly near the shoreline. Wind stirred the tall oak trees surrounding the property, and the restored wraparound porch creaked softly beneath my boots. It was almost impossible to believe that after investing countless hours preserving one of the oldest homes on the lake, my first official welcome from the community arrived in the form of a bill for events that supposedly began years before I had ever heard of this neighborhood. Less than an hour later, another vehicle pulled into the circular driveway. Susan stepped out carrying a slim folder beneath one arm and greeted me politely before congratulating me on the restoration. Her smile remained friendly until she asked whether I had received the association's notice. When I confirmed that I had, she calmly explained that every previous owner had failed to satisfy the outstanding balance, and that responsibility now rested with me because the debt followed the property. I asked a simple question that seemed to surprise her. Could she show me the original records proving every dollar listed in the demand had actually remained unpaid since 1998? For the first time during our conversation, she hesitated before answering that the board had maintained the same balance for many years and considered the matter settled. I thanked her for stopping by, wished her a pleasant afternoon, and watched as she drove away along the quiet lakeside road. I had restored old houses long enough to know that beautiful surfaces sometimes concealed forgotten problems beneath them. What I did not yet realize was that the oldest mystery hidden inside this mansion was not behind its walls. It was buried somewhere inside decades of financial records that very few people had ever bothered to read. My name is Daniel Carter, and restoring forgotten homes had never been about making quick money. It was about giving remarkable places a second chance after years of neglect. Long before I purchased the Lakefront mansion, I had spent nearly 20 years buying abandoned historic properties across several states, carefully preserving their original character while updating them to modern safety standards. Some people collected classic cars. Others restored antique furniture. I restored homes because every old house carried a story waiting to be respected instead of erased. The mansion beside the lake immediately captured my attention the first time I saw it. Built decades earlier with handcrafted stone fireplaces, towering oak staircases, and wide windows overlooking nearly half a mile of open water, it had once been considered one of the most beautiful residences in the county. By the time I discovered it, years of neglect had taken their toll. Sections of the roof leaked during heavy rain. The dock had partially collapsed into the lake, faded paint peeled from the exterior walls, and vines had slowly climbed across the front porch columns. Most buyers only saw expensive repairs. I saw craftsmanship worth saving. Before purchasing the property, I hired licensed inspectors, reviewed structural reports, obtained a professional appraisal, and worked closely with a respected title company. My attorney examined the closing documents line by line, verifying ownership history, recorded easements, tax obligations, and every document required before the transaction could close. Everything appeared orderly. Outstanding property taxes had already been satisfied through the closing process. Title insurance was issued without exception, and the deed transferred cleanly into my name. Nothing suggested that a financial obligation stretching back to 1998 remained attached to the property. Over the following 18 months, nearly every day began before sunrise and ended well after dark. Skilled carpenters rebuilt damaged woodwork using traditional techniques. Electricians carefully modernized outdated wiring without disturbing the home's historic appearance. Stone masons repaired the original chimney by matching each weathered block. Landscapers cleared years of overgrown vegetation until the shoreline became visible again from the front porch. Every improvement was documented with permits, invoices, inspection reports, and photographs because careful records had always protected both my projects and my reputation. As the restoration neared completion, several neighbors stopped by to compliment the work. Many told me they were grateful to see the mansion alive again after sitting empty for so many years. Their kindness made the community feel welcoming, which made the certified letter from the Homeowners Association even more confusing. That evening, I carried the demand notice into my home office and placed it beside the thick closing binder I had received on the day of purchase. The contrast immediately stood out. My purchase file contained hundreds of organized pages prepared by experienced professionals. The Homeowners Association demand consisted mainly of a balanced summary listing old charges, accumulated interest, penalties, and a final amount due without explaining how those numbers had been calculated over nearly 3 decades. I quietly compared both stacks of paperwork across my desk while the last light of the evening reflected across the calm lake outside my window. One collection of documents carefully explained every step that brought me to this property. The other expected me to accept 27 years of financial history without showing how any of it began. That difference alone told me exactly where I needed to start looking. The following morning, I called the telephone number printed at the bottom of the demand notice and politely requested copies of every record supporting the balance. The woman who answered transferred me to Susan Whitmore without hesitation. She recognized my name immediately and spoke with the same calm confidence she had shown in my driveway. She explained that the Homeowners Association had maintained the account for many years and considered the balance accurate because each board had simply carried it forward from the previous one. I thanked her for the explanation and asked whether she could provide the original assessment notices, payment history, annual ledgers, board approvals, and accounting records beginning in 1998. There was a brief pause before she answered that the association normally did not release decades of internal financial files unless required during legal proceedings. Instead, she offered to send me another account summary showing the current total with accumulated interest. I replied that a summary was not the same as evidence. I simply wanted to understand how the numbers had been created. 2 days later, another certified envelope arrived at the mansion. Inside was a revised balance sheet showing the same total along with additional late fees that had been added after my first notice. The figures were arranged neatly in columns, but nothing identified the original homeowner, the dates of individual assessments, or whether any payments had ever been credited. There were no copies of invoices, canceled checks, deposit records, meeting minutes, or annual budgets. It was only a spreadsheet listing totals that had apparently been copied from one year to the next. I spread the pages across my dining room table beside my closing documents and immediately noticed something unusual. The closing file prepared by the title company referenced property taxes, recorded easements, title insurance, and every known financial obligation discovered during the purchase process. Yet nowhere did it mention an outstanding Homeowners Association debt approaching $70,000. If such an obligation had legitimately existed for nearly 3 decades, it should have appeared somewhere during the transaction. Curious rather than frustrated, I contacted the title officer who had supervised my purchase. She agreed to review the file and promised to compare the association's claim against the public records examined before closing. While waiting for her response, I attended the next Homeowners Association meeting as an observer. Susan presented routine business with practiced professionalism before mentioning that collection efforts were continuing against certain overdue accounts. She never spoke my name, but several board members glanced in my direction. When the meeting opened for homeowner questions, I stood and politely asked whether the association possessed complete accounting records tracing the alleged balance from its original assessment through every subsequent year. Susan answered that the board had always relied upon the financial records inherited from previous administrations and believed those records to be reliable. I thanked her and sat down without another question. Walking back to my truck beneath the fading evening light, I realized something important. Susan never claimed she had personally verified the debt. She only said she trusted what had been passed down to her. That small distinction stayed with me during the quiet drive home because inherited assumptions have a way of surviving for years, especially when nobody ever asks to see the first page of the file. 3 days later, the title officer called exactly when she promised. Her voice was calm, but I immediately noticed a different tone from our earlier conversations. She explained that her office had completed a full review of every document used during my purchase and had compared those records with the Homeowners Association demand. According to the closing file, there had been no recorded balance, no pending collection action, no filed lien, and no disclosure identifying an outstanding debt attached to the property at the time ownership transferred to me. She added that if an enforceable obligation of that size had been properly documented, it almost certainly would have appeared during the title examination or required resolution before closing. After thanking her, I contacted my attorney and scheduled a meeting for the following morning. I arrived carrying 2 organized binders. One contained every document from the purchase of the mansion. The other contained every letter, balance summary, and notice sent by the Homeowners Association. We spent nearly 4 hours comparing both sets of records page by page. The more carefully we looked, the more unusual the situation became. Every public record appeared complete, while nearly every important detail inside the association's financial claim remained unexplained. There was no payment history identifying the original homeowner responsible for the first assessment. There were no annual statements showing how interest had been calculated. There were no meeting minutes authorizing the penalties that continued increasing over the years. My attorney finally leaned back in his chair and quietly said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the most important evidence is not the paperwork someone gives you. It is the paperwork they cannot produce. That afternoon, we submitted formal written requests seeking copies of the association's historical financial ledgers, annual budgets, treasurer reports, board meeting minutes, audit reports, and archive correspondence connected to the account dating back to 1998. We also requested every document identifying how ownership of the alleged debt had been tracked as the property changed hands over the years. Several days passed before the response arrived. The association produced selected board minutes from recent years, several annual budget summaries, and another account balance sheet. What remained missing was far more revealing than what had been provided. Entire years of financial ledgers could not be located. Treasurer reports from the late 1990s and early 2000s were unavailable. Original invoices supporting the earliest assessments were missing. Documentation explaining how unpaid balances had accumulated through multiple ownership transfers simply did not exist in the records they supplied. My attorney carefully arranged every received document across the conference table while creating a timeline on a large legal pad. Empty spaces quickly appeared between the years where essential records should have been. Looking at those gaps felt almost like examining a historic mansion with missing floorboards. The visible structure remained standing, but crucial pieces underneath had quietly disappeared long ago. As evening settled over the lake outside my office windows, I reviewed the growing timeline once more. Every missing ledger, every absent report, and every unexplained balance made one possibility increasingly difficult to ignore. The Homeowners Association might not have been hiding decades of proof. It was beginning to look as though the proof had never existed in the first place. The investigation changed direction the week my attorney introduced me to a forensic accountant who specialized in reconstructing incomplete financial records. Instead of asking whether the Homeowners Association had enough documents to support its claim, she asked a far more interesting question. Could the numbers themselves survive independent verification? We gathered every annual budget, balance summary, bank report, meeting minute, and financial statement the association had provided, then arranged them across a long conference table in chronological order. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Annual assessments increased gradually over the years. Reserve contributions fluctuated with maintenance projects, and collection totals were carried forward from one report to the next. But once she began comparing individual figures line by line, subtle inconsistencies started appearing. Several annual balances increased even though no supporting assessments had been documented. Interest calculations changed without explanation between reporting years. Administrative fees appeared before any board minutes authorizing them could be found. Most surprising of all, the alleged unpaid balance from 1998 remained almost perfectly intact despite the property changing ownership multiple times over nearly 3 decades. Normally, financial records leave a trail. Payments are received, balances change, collection activity is documented, and adjustments are explained. Here, the account seemed frozen in time, growing only through added penalties while leaving almost no evidence of how the original amount had ever been established. Curious about those irregularities, my attorney submitted another formal request asking specifically for archived bank deposit records, historical audit reports, and any supporting documents showing that payments connected to the property had been received or rejected. While waiting for a response, I visited the county historical archives searching for information unrelated to the association itself. Property transfer records, probate filings, estate documents, and old newspaper notices slowly revealed the long history of the mansion's previous owners. Every ownership transfer appeared properly recorded, yet none referenced an unresolved homeowners association debt requiring satisfaction before the sale. That absence became increasingly difficult to ignore. A few days later, the association produced several additional financial documents, but instead of resolving questions, they created new ones. Annual ledger totals did not consistently match corresponding budget reports. Certain opening balances differed from the previous year's closing balances by amounts that could not be explained through ordinary accounting entries. Even the formatting changed dramatically between different periods, suggesting that portions of the historical records had been recreated rather than preserved from the original books. The forensic accountant quietly circled several figures with a red pencil before looking up and saying something I will never forget. Numbers tell the truth when they are allowed to remain connected. These numbers had been disconnected somewhere along the way. That single observation transformed the entire investigation. We were no longer trying to prove that I did not owe an old debt. We were beginning to determine whether the debt itself had ever been accurately maintained from the very beginning. As the sun disappeared behind the lake outside my office windows, I looked once more at the neatly organized binders covering my desk. Every missing record, every inconsistent balance, and every unexplained adjustment pointed toward the same conclusion. The story hidden inside those financial files was becoming far older and far more complicated than a simple collection notice delivered to my front door. The breakthrough arrived where I least expected to find it. Instead of appearing inside the Homeowners Association files, it surfaced in a climate-controlled storage room beneath the county records building. One of the archivists remembered that many neighborhood developers had donated original planning documents decades earlier after construction was completed. Most people never requested those boxes because they were not part of the ordinary public records search. Curious, I submitted a request for every archived document connected to the original development of the community. Nearly an hour later, the archivist returned pushing a small cart stacked with aging binders, engineering drawings, meeting packets, and correspondence carefully preserved inside protective sleeves. The faint smell of old paper filled the quiet room as I slowly turned each page. Most of the material documented road construction, utility easements, landscaping plans, and early architectural guidelines. Then I found a binder labeled Financial Transition 1998. Inside were letters exchanged between the original developer, the first Homeowners Association board, and the accounting firm responsible for transferring financial responsibility after the neighborhood was completed. One letter immediately caught my attention. It referenced an unresolved accounting reconciliation involving several properties, including the mansion I now owned. According to the correspondence, The developer had disputed a series of assessments that appeared to have been entered before the homeowners association officially assumed responsibility for operating the community. The letter recommended freezing those balances until an independent review could determine whether they had been recorded correctly. Attached to the correspondence was another document that proved even more significant. It was a meeting memorandum noting that the disputed accounts should not be collected until supporting documentation could be verified because original transaction records were incomplete during the transition between the developer and the newly formed association. I carefully photographed every page while my attorney requested certified copies directly from the archives. Later that afternoon, the forensic accountant compared those newly discovered documents against the association records we had already assembled. The timeline suddenly became much clearer. The disputed balance appeared during the exact period when financial control changed hands. Yet every later board simply carried the figure forward as though the original verification had already been completed. There was still no evidence showing that the investigation recommended in 1998 had ever actually occurred. Instead, the balance seemed to have been accepted as fact through repetition rather than proof. My attorney quietly smiled for the first time since we began working together. He explained that historical records created before any current board members became involved often carry significant weight because they are far less likely to reflect modern disputes or personal opinions. As evenings settled across the lake, we organized the newly certified archive documents beside the existing financial timeline. What had once looked like an ordinary collection dispute now revealed the outline of an accounting question left unresolved for nearly 3 decades. Susan Whitmore may have sincerely believed she was enforcing a legitimate obligation inherited from previous boards, but the original records suggested something entirely different. The debt everyone had treated as unquestionable since 1998 might have been placed on hold before it was ever supposed to exist at all. By the time formal legal proceedings began, the conference table inside my attorney's office had disappeared beneath carefully labeled binders. Every document had been arranged according to a single timeline beginning in 1998 and continuing through the day I purchased the mansion. Instead of arguing over opinions, we focused entirely on records. Certified county archives sat beside title reports, financial summaries, board meeting minutes, correspondence from the original developer, and the forensic accountant's detailed analysis explaining every inconsistency discovered during the investigation. The pattern was impossible to ignore. What had been presented to me as an unquestionable debt had traveled through nearly 3 decades of homeowners association leadership without anyone confirming whether the original balance had ever been properly established. During discovery, additional documents were exchanged between both sides. For the first time, complete internal communications from several former board administrations became available for review. Among hundreds of routine emails and memoranda, one series of discussions immediately stood out. Years earlier, multiple board members had privately questioned whether sufficient documentation existed to support several inherited accounts dating back to the association's earliest years. Rather than conducting the independent reconciliation recommended in the original transition records, each successive board had simply postponed the issue while carrying the balances into another fiscal year. Eventually, the disputed figures became accepted through repetition instead of verification. When the hearing finally arrived, the courtroom remained quiet as both sides presented their evidence. My attorney began with the certified title documents confirming that no recorded lien or enforceable financial obligation had been identified during my purchase. The forensic accountant then explained how the historical balances failed to follow consistent accounting practices, demonstrating that critical calculations lacked supporting documentation. Finally, the certified archive records from the county established that the original disputed assessments had been specifically identified for future review because the underlying transaction records were incomplete during the transition from the developer to the newly formed homeowners association. Susan Whitmore testified respectfully and never attempted to exaggerate the facts. She explained that she had relied upon records inherited from previous administrations because she believed them to be accurate. Listening from my seat, I realized she had become the public face of a problem that actually began long before she accepted her position. The judge carefully questioned both sides about the missing historical documentation, asking whether anyone could produce original financial records proving that the disputed 1998 balance had ever been independently verified after the transition memorandum recommended further review. No such records were presented. The silence that followed carried more weight than any lengthy argument. Weeks of investigation had led to this single unanswered question, and despite decades having passed, nobody could fill the gap left inside the financial history. As the hearing concluded, the judge gathered the binders for final review before announcing that a written decision would follow after examining the extensive documentary record. Walking out of the courthouse beneath a clear afternoon sky, I felt something I had not experienced since opening that first certified envelope on my front porch. Regardless of the final ruling, the story hidden inside those old financial files had finally been brought into the open, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the original records were being judged by evidence instead of assumption. The written decision arrived on a quiet Thursday morning in another certified envelope, but this one carried the seal of the court instead of the homeowners association. I placed it on the same dining room table where I had first spread out the collection notice months earlier. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Back then, the table had held questions with very few answers. Now it held years of research, certified records, expert analysis, and a complete timeline stretching back to 1998. As I carefully unfolded the court's decision, every page reflected the same conclusion that had slowly emerged throughout the investigation. The court found that the Homeowners Association had failed to establish sufficient documentary support for the disputed historical balance it had attempted to collect. The decision explained that while associations possess the authority to assess lawful dues and enforce legitimate obligations, they also bear the responsibility of maintaining reliable records supporting those claims. In this case, the original documentation necessary to validate the disputed balance had never been produced. The transition records from the county archives demonstrated that the earliest assessments had been identified for additional verification before collection, yet no evidence showed that verification had ever been completed. The court therefore determined that the claimed obligation could not be enforced against me. In addition, the collection notice, accumulated penalties, and related administrative charges tied to that disputed balance were declared unenforceable. Reading those words brought an unexpected sense of relief. It was not satisfaction from winning an argument. It was the comfort of knowing that careful documentation still mattered. Several days later, the Homeowners Association held a special meeting open to every resident. Susan Whitmore stood before the room and calmly explained that the board would comply fully with the court's ruling. She acknowledged that historical accounting practices inherited from previous administrations had not received the level of verification they deserved and announced that an independent review of the association's oldest financial records would begin immediately. Rather than defending outdated assumptions, the board voted to modernize its record retention procedures, commission a complete historical audit, and establish new documentation standards for future assessments. The atmosphere inside the meeting room felt noticeably different from my first visit months earlier. Questions were answered with records instead of assumptions, and discussions focused on transparency rather than tradition. After the meeting ended, Susan walked over and thanked me for remaining professional throughout the process. She admitted that she had believed the inherited records were accurate because every previous board had accepted them without question. I told her I understood. The problem had never been about one individual. It had been about a system that gradually stopped asking whether its oldest records could still support its newest decisions. Driving home along the lakeshore that evening, I watched the setting sun reflect across the same calm water that had greeted me on the day I first moved into the restored mansion. The house itself had never changed. Its stone walls, wide porch, handcrafted staircase, and quiet shoreline had remained exactly where they belonged. The only thing that had truly changed was that the history surrounding the property had finally been separated from assumptions and anchored once again to evidence. The mystery hidden inside those aging financial files had lasted for nearly 3 decades, but in the end it was resolved the same way every lasting restoration should be completed, by carefully uncovering the original foundation instead of simply painting over the cracks. Several months have passed since the court issued its decision, and every morning I still begin the day the same way. I carry a cup of coffee onto the restored wraparound porch, listen to the gentle waves meeting the shoreline, and watch the sunrise reflect across the lake that first convinced me this old mansion deserved another chance. The difference now is not the view. The difference is the silence. No certified envelopes weighed against the front door. No unexplained financial demands interrupt the peace that this property was always meant to provide. The mansion has become exactly what I hoped it would be when I first unlocked the front door after closing. It is a home built upon solid craftsmanship instead of unanswered questions. The Homeowners Association also changed in ways I never expected. Following the independent audit announced after the court's ruling, the board adopted entirely new financial procedures requiring supporting documentation for historical balances, standardized record retention policies, and regular outside accounting reviews. Archived files were digitized, missing records were identified, and every inherited account received careful examination before being carried into another fiscal year. Several longtime residents later told me they finally understood financial reports that had confused them for years because everything was now organized with clear explanations instead of assumptions. Susan Whitmore remained involved during the transition and worked alongside the other board members to implement the recommendations. We occasionally crossed paths while walking through the neighborhood or attending community meetings, and our conversations became surprisingly ordinary. We discussed landscaping projects, dock repairs, seasonal maintenance, and neighborhood events instead of disputed records. Looking back, I realized she had never intended to create the problem. She had simply inherited a system that trusted old conclusions more than original evidence. That lesson stayed with me long after the legal case ended. Every restoration project teaches something different. Some teach patience. Others teach craftsmanship. This mansion taught me that records deserve the same careful preservation as historic buildings. When important documents disappear or stop being questioned, assumptions quietly take their place, and assumptions have a way of becoming accepted as truth simply because enough time has passed. One afternoon, I opened the same storage cabinet where I had kept every binder connected to the case. The certified archive documents rested beside the title reports, accounting analysis, correspondence, and court decision that had slowly uncovered the truth. I closed the cabinet without throwing anything away. Historic homes preserve their stories inside walls, foundations, and original blueprints. This collection of papers had become part of the history of the mansion as well, reminding me that restoring the past sometimes means protecting facts instead of wood and stone. As the evening light settles across the lake, I often think back to the moment I first opened that homeowners association letter demanding payment for a debt that supposedly began decades before I arrived. At the time, it felt like the beginning of an overwhelming problem. Now I understand it was actually the beginning of an honest investigation. The mansion did not need someone willing to write a check without asking questions. It needed someone willing to read every page before accepting someone else's version of history. In the end, the greatest restoration was never the roof, the porch, or the weathered stone walls. It was restoring the simple idea that real justice is built the same way every lasting home should be built, one verified foundation at a time.